Welcome to the Vintage Vibe.
Hey, welcome to the Vibe, and my apologies, I know it has been some time. I've got a whole bunch of videos to get out to you this summer, including, I'm going to call it the quintessential collection of Marantz receivers. I think we've got like about 8 Marantz receivers to take a peek at minimum. A whole bunch of Pioneer SX series receivers, Macintosh, the legendary Vitavox speaker, a bunch of boutique speakers made by Schmidt Audio, as well as some 1960s tube amplification. I mean, you name it, there's a whole bunch coming right at you. And this week we're going to start off with Technics. I hope you like that little lucite lamp to start things off. Very cool, very vintage. As well as we've got a little bit of room treatment now here. Yes, room treatment is an important component of audio. So we're going to start off with this video for any other reason than to free up some space on my phone, because we're running out, and that means I'm buying too much vintage audio. So you can live vicariously through me, and we'll talk as usual what to expect with a pair of Technics SB-6000s, what you could pay for a pair, obviously how do they sound, and whether or not they deserve a place in your vintage audio collection. All that and a bunch more here on The Vibe.
The SB-6000 is part of the famed linear phase speaker systems line by Technics. It is a large two-way, it's ported with a 12-inch woofer and a rather large, unique tweeter up top. Now, these tweeters are, equipped with a massive magnet. And you can see the awkward binding post to the bottom of the frame, as well as a separate level control. Now, we'll come back to that because these can be quite problematic by their design, something I had to tackle. Now, keep your watches away again from this magnet. It's very much the same as what's in Technics SB-6000. On paper, the specs look, well, pretty flat and decent. It looks like they've got a solid bass response down to about 45 hertz without room loading, and a high frequency response of close to 20,000 hertz. 93 dB represents a fairly easy speaker to drive, and a modest 6 ohm impedance, well, that's not too unheard of in modern loudspeakers nowadays.
I want to take a moment to talk a little bit about these unique speakers. The SB-6000 is not your run-of-the-mill kind of 1970s speaker. And in fact, the linear phase design that Technics claimed to coin also had some very unique marketing behind it and an interesting history. So we'll talk a little bit about that. So the dead giveaway of a linear phase type speaker is typically the arrangement of the drivers in the cabinet. So a traditional speaker, you've got your box, and the front baffle or the front of the cabinet usually has its tweeter, the mid-range, and the woofer kind of all in a row, for lack of better words. Whereas a linear phase speaker may have the bass driver kind of here on the front baffle, a mid-range mounted slightly behind it, sometimes even in its own enclosure, and the tweeter sometimes even further behind that. And the idea was to change the timing in which the sound reaches your ears. Now, the crossover played a big role in this as well. You can see the crossover of the 6000s. They're high quality using air coils, capacitors, resistors, this 12 dB octave filter, and what we're going to call a sharp cutoff for the woofer. Now, what does all that mean? Well, the crossover would help control, again, the timing in which the sound would reach your ear from the separate transducers or speakers. And in a crossover, you could kind of have a sharp cutoff, or you can sometimes have kind of blurring where the different speakers may create the same frequencies. Whereas in this case, the woofer's frequency kind of stops here and the tweeter starts there, so they don't blur or reproduce some of the same sounds. Now that could be good, and Technics in this case claimed that it was. It was part of why it created such a realistic type sound. Now, they went so as far to say in their marketing that they would literally put listeners in a room, and they'd put a pair of linear phase speakers up on a stage with a current across them, and they would play music through these speakers and then have a musician off to the side who would then also play the same music, and they would try to dupe the audience so that they wouldn't know which was which. I can attest that they are a realistic type sounding speaker in that they do a good job creating space. We'll go a little deeper into the sound in just a short while here. So the design of the actual woofer itself, they used a paper driver. It had a material in it called armid, as well as just your paper pulp, a stiff driver, so that as the speaker was moving smoothly in and out on the piston, it wouldn't flex. Now, when a speaker flexes and it's not intended to, then it could create unwanted resonances or sounds, distortion, essentially. Now, they helped control that speaker with a massive magnet, as well as a very heavy die-cast frame, again, to reduce vibrations and resonances. The voice coil was even made out of aluminum rather than copper. Now, the tweeter, again, high efficiency, very low distortion. And they used a heat kind of injected polyurethane with a silk over top of that. So again, exotic type materials. And they had a aluminum ring that was kind of placed at the junction between the diaphragm and the actual voice coil. And this would aid in dispersion. And again, as Technics put it, added to that realism that the speakers could create. They try to make it sound more like a full range speaker rather than a two-way. And again, I will say that these don't sound like the typical two-way speaker. They certainly sound bigger. Now, talking about big, they are pretty big. I mean, they're 60 pounds, they're heavy cabinets, they're well braced inside. They even went as far as when they cut out the hole for the 12-inch woofer, rather than discarding that material, that MDF board, they mounted it to the back side of the cabinet just to add rigidity, and stiffness, again, reducing any unwanted resonances. So there's a little bit of information about the SP6000s. Now let's take a peek at some of the things that may be a challenge if you happen to find a used pair.
So as cool and unique as the woofers are, that's also a fault, because you're likely not going to find replacements if you blow a pair, or if you find a pair with blown woofers. Now I'm zooming in here on the surrounds, which are new in this case. Technics did use a foam with a rubberized coating that was quite good, but they do fail after 30 plus years. And you can see we had to actually make a surround, or splice a surround, cut it and splice it, because they're not quite 12 inches. Now, this takes a little bit of skill to do this. So you want to service the potentiometer, the level control, because it's staticky and you're finding that your tweeter's intermittently cutting out. Well, it's not so easy with these speakers. First, you have to physically remove the woofer from the cabinet so you can get at the potentiometer's backside. You have to remove the tweeter and remove the cover to be able to get at the nut that you see right here that holds the potentiometer physically in place. So this is pretty labor intensive. Also, you can just go inside the woofer cabinet to remove that little tiny metal box with 3 wires going into it. Well, at least they put some nice heavy insulation in here. I mean, that's a plus, but it really is quite frustrating. Now, once you get it out, you've got this potentiometer here that you can't physically spray deoxit anywhere inside. You have to fold back these 4 little metal tabs to be able to open it up. And then you see a little foam gasket, a little metal wiper in that box to the left, and a ceramic disc with carbon traces on it that you have to clean.
Now, if you thought, hey, that's easy enough, I think I could do that. The most frustrating part is when you reassemble everything and you go to test them and you still have the cutting out of the tweeter depending on where you have the potentiometer placed. So the little metal kind of wiper glides across that disc with the carbon trace on it, which will control the resistance and the output of the tweeter. Billy's hanging out with us for a little bit. Billy, say hi to the camera. The challenge is that carbon trace starts to wear, and then regardless of how you clean the ceramic disc, you'll have an intermittent tweeter. And although it might be slightly better, your only solution is to try to find a new part, which is not easy, as you can imagine, with speakers that are this unique.
Another letdown is the speaker terminals Technics used on these.
So you've got these binding posts that look like banana jacks, but they aren't, which is disappointing because they're really just meant for bare wire. So you've got these big lugs that you unscrew, and then you slide your wire through really a guiding hole, which doesn't allow you much bigger than probably 16 gauge. So then you can tighten down the lug on top of it to make a connection. It's probably one of the first things I would change with these speakers is to put a good pair of quality banana binding posts to be able to use whatever wires you want if I was going to keep them. Kind of a letdown in the design. It would have been a very simple kind of thing to include, but I guess not as common in the late 70s. How do they sound? What do they cost? And should you have a pair in your vintage audio collection? Let's start with the cost. You can find a pair probably, anywhere from $50 to $75 to as much as $400 or $450, 2023 in Canadian dollars. Now I picked up this pair for $50. They needed extensive cleaning, and as you know, I had to replace the surrounds on the speakers as well as one attenuator. So I was probably into them for $175, which is not bad for a pretty decent sounding pair of two-ways that are kind of unique looking. Certainly if you were to sell them, you'd get your money back and more at that point. So they can be good value. Now, how do they sound? I mentioned earlier they did a good job with recreating space. So what I mean by that is there's good depth, and the instruments, when you're listening to your favorite track, are nicely positioned in place. You don't kind of clearly say here's left speaker and right speaker. There's a good center image. There's decent dispersion, so I'm not limited to a very kind of narrow sweet spot on my chair right here. And they provide a lot of upper frequency energy is how I'm going to put it, which was good when I was in the kind of basement with them, which is pretty acoustically dead. In fact, the speakers in the basement probably sounded in the top kind of 10 of speakers I've had down there before, because they overcame a lot of the heavy carpeting and the furnishings, so on and so forth, with this treble energy and this wide dispersion. The downside to these speakers is that they produce a lot of bass. For some people, that's a plus. If you like, bass heavy speakers, these produce it and then some. The weird thing is they produce more bass than a pair of SB-6000s. Now I've had probably 3 or 4 pair of 7000s, and they have a tighter bass. They play deep, but these are thumpier. And again, that may be a problem depending on your room. So up here, I couldn't possibly have them as a reference type pair of speakers because there was too much bass energy. It was fatiguing that there was so much. So that can be a make-break point for some people. And for that reason alone, myself, I really couldn't have them in my vintage audio collection unless they were a secondary system in a somewhat acoustically dead room. So it's a pass for me, but a unique pair of speakers from a unique time in Technics history. I would hold off and look for a pair of SB-7000s because I think they do what the 6000 do and that much more. Thanks for joining us here on The Vintage Vibe. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we'll see you shortly for another video.